I'm Dr. Tracy Stecker, and welcome to the Choosing Help podcast. Choosing Help presents conversations about courage, connection, and the transformative power of asking for support. Through candid discussions, expert insights, and real world stories, this podcast breaks down stigma and opens doors to understanding. Join our community committed to compassion and courage. Because when we choose help, we choose life. I'm Dr. Tracy Stecker, and I'm honored to have Francesca Arnoldy with me today. Francesca is a community doula and a death literacy advocate. She is a well-respected thought leader on end-of-life care. She's also the author of several books, including her latest book entitled Kindred Grief Care. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I um I was reading through your book and I took a couple of notes on how you describe grief and loss, and I just thought it was beautiful in a way. I wanted to read some of your lines, if that's okay. You say, significant loss is meant to be felt, expressed, held, and digested. You also say grief is boundless and wild. I loved that. And universal. We all experience grief. And you say mourning can be messy. All of those seem very, very true. Um, as a grief expert, as a death literacy advocate, how would you say people in general should prepare for the grief process or grief in general? What would be some advice you'd give to people?
I think that there's no way to prepare in order to bypass grief. I think what's maybe more healthy is to think about, not that that's what you were insinuating, but
Yeah.
I think for me, what's healthy as a society is to name and recognize smaller losses and the grief that ensues following those losses and be able
Okay.
to claim that as grief so that we can have more conversations, so that we can be more in tune with our feelings and our personal responses, and so that we can start to build and strengthen our coping techniques for these less intense experiences of loss, so
Mhm.
that when we have a more significant, profound loss, we feel a little bit more capable of navigating it. We have a little bit more trust in ourselves and in the process.
I think that's brilliant. So death is not the only space where we experience grief. We experience all sorts of grief throughout life. But you're saying we don't necessarily name it grief. And then, so our way of preparing for the big one, whatever that might be, it gets complicated because we haven't practiced along the way.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a familiar realm to us because we haven't noticed ourselves stepping into it or allowed ourselves to step into it. So sometimes with these smaller, more minor losses, we just tell ourselves things like, just keep going, plow through, chin up, and be stoic instead of leaning into it and
Hmm.
feeling what's actually coming up and giving ourselves permission to
Hmm.
grieve those smaller losses and then to develop the tools to recognize sources of support who will show up for us and won't minimize our experience of it.
So any one individual's experience with grief will be different. It'll be their own individual experience. However, um, it might it might look like I'm going to back up. I was gonna say something and it went off track. But many people, as a mental health professional, I work with many people who are avoiding any sort of negative experience. So, many people are saying, I don't want pain. I don't want to experience any suffering. I'm going to bypass all of that. I'd rather be numb and work really hard to perfect numbness, or finding joy. But any sort of negative experience is not something that they're moving toward. And you're saying, your advice really is just the opposite. When you have those moments of sadness, of loss, name it. Go ahead and name it. You can even name it as grief. It's loss of potentially something. Name it as grief and practice building the skill of, I don't want to say dealing with it, but managing it.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me as a parent is with my kids, we developed this ritual that we call our blessing stone ritual. And it came from noticing the power of beginnings and endings. So, marking that moment with some intention. We did it at times like when we were building our home and we had the foundation. And so we decided to bless our home before we built it. And we took these little stones that we just found in the property, brought them over, filled them up with all of our hope, love, and wishes, and had the opportunity to speak them aloud if we wanted, but it's optional, and then to throw it down into the hole, which would then become our home and our foundation of our home. And then I noticed it was equally important to do that when we were approaching an ending. So something like the loss of our pet dog, which was
Mhm.
really hard on us all. And my kids were pretty young when it happened. We incorporated that same ritual into her dying. So, encouraged my loved ones to go into the property, find something on the ground that was already fallen, whether it was a leaf or a flower bud or a stone or a stick, whatever called to the individual person, to gather back up at her grave site, fill up our blessing stone nature object with all of our love, all of our gratitude, the memories that we held, and our wishes for Bella's rest, time of rest, and her lack of suffering, and gratitude for that. Had a chance to each share memories if we wanted to. And then we buried those stones with her body. And it's even for things like we've had a wonderful vacation and it's coming to an end, and we're noticing that we're kind of getting cranky about
Mhm.
packing up and about returning to regular life. Instead of trying to avoid that or just rush through it, I am a proponent of sinking into it and doing the blessing stone ritual. So picking something up, maybe we're at the ocean, the edge of water works really well, but even in a driveway, and naming some of the highlights of the trip, what we've really enjoyed and what we've really appreciated, as a way of saying, like, we're going to carry those good times and those memories and all of this appreciation with us as we recognize that this time is coming to a close.
Yeah. Yeah, it's gratitude. I hear a lot of gratitude coming out for you, saying thank you for the experiences, even though the experiences are ending. Taking that moment, however, any individual wants to express gratitude, or um, marking a moment. You know, you write a lot in your book, Kindred Grief Care. You write about how to support somebody who's going through grief. And one of the stories you wrote I thought was hilarious and lovely at the same time. As a birth doula, you would work with families and then check on them after. And you were talking about the skill of listening and how you, as a birth doula, you would check on them after the baby was born and see how they were doing. And they kept telling you their birth story, and you were thinking, I know. I was there. And it was nice that you were recognizing that they were telling that story not for you, but for themselves. It was their processing. So same with any sort of experience, whether it's joyful or sad. We do as humans need to process. Many of us don't want to, but we do process the experience. And part of the way of processing is talking it out. And so for any of us to be able to take time and listen to a person, even if you already know the story, let them talk. just engage in the skill of listening. Would you speak to that a little bit and how important listening is, especially for the grief process?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a wonderful learning opportunity for me because initially I was questioning it. Did they think that I wasn't fully present? Did they think that I was distracted? And, after a number of times, I realized, no, this is really not about me at all. It's really about them because birth, similarly to death, can feel really overwhelming, can feel really intense, and can feel incredibly surreal. And it calls so much of us, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever language people use about their inner workings and socially. So all of that is being kind of called into the experience simultaneously, and it can feel like a lot to wrap your head around. So I do think that the simple, in terms of you're stripping away and kind of unlearning things, the simple but powerful act of creating space for someone to explore what happened to them and to work it out aloud and to like have those thoughts come out in a really messy, unorganized, disorganized way is a
Hmm.
beautiful gift we can offer to
Hmm.
somebody. Now, not everyone is going to want to speak at a certain moment or feel ready for that, or maybe they have a different outlet, so there's not pressure, but that availability is a beautiful, beautiful gift. And to not interrupt it, to be patient, to allow, to invite, and to not jump into that fixing mentality, or to soften and quiet that inclination that will naturally come up, wanting that person to be okay, to be better, and to rush through that process. To instead walk alongside them, go at their pace, and let them know that you are there as a presence and as a support, and they don't have to have it all figured out, and you're going to be with them through the murk of it.
Yeah, I think and this is a wonderful book for folks who are supporting or just care about somebody who has experienced loss. I think everybody's had that experience of just not knowing what to do or what to say, and this book helps provide some guidelines on what to do and say while somebody is grieving. You do have some please do this, and you do have some please do not do this guidelines, which I think are very helpful. One of your guidelines was it's okay to listen. Let them tell their story, and they might need to tell it over and over, or they might not tell it, but it's okay to be a listener. I really like how you frame that because you say, let their wisdom on their grief is what you should follow. You don't have to tell them your own story. You can if you want to, or you can ask them if it's okay if you want to share that. But go ahead and follow their wisdom on their process at that moment, which I think is really helpful advice. Do you want to go through a couple of the other big um, suggestions when you know somebody is grieving and you want to be supportive to them, but you just don't know what to do or how to do it?
Sure, it does depend on the a couple of things, which I think we have to pause and check first before we step into somebody's experience. So thinking about, who am I? What are my strengths? What's my level of availability? What's my emotional bandwidth and capacity? Am I currently grieving something that feels really tender right now? So that you can gauge what level of activity you want to be involved in, because you really do need to honor that, because that's best for you and the other person. And then you think about the other
Mhm.
person, and who are they? How much do you know about them? You might not. And so you might come in with just some general questions and you're trying to assess that. But if you do know them, what do you know about them? What do you know about their style of processing? How open have they been with you in the past? And their life circumstances. What might their potential needs be? Because what I've learned from grieving people is that big, broad question of what can I do? How can I help is generally not ideal. it actually puts more
Hmm.
burden on the grieving person. They feel overwhelmed already. They feel lost. They feel exhausted. And now they have to do the work of coming up with something to offer you so that you can feel better about offering yourself. And instead, really trying to think about something that's more specific to your dynamic, your relationship, and their loss and the circumstances around that loss. Something that I take from my work as a birth doula initially that I bring into grief care is the idea of a list that grieving people can use and reference. And I have this list in the book. It's the practical offerings. I also have a handout version for people so that they can print it off. I incorporate this into some of the grief healing work that I do, the non-clinical community care work. And it's a list of, I mean, it's dozens and dozens of practical ideas for people who are grieving. And in terms of their home and their dependence and their health needs, it's mundane. It's like toilet paper and paper towels, or it's paying bills, or it's dropping off stamps, or it's walking a dog. So many different ideas in there. And what I offer that as an invitation for a grieving person to look through and decide which ones apply and which ones don't. So they can
Hmm.
cross off the things that just aren't applicable in their life or their circumstances or that moment, or the things that they actually want to continue doing themselves because it gives them a sense of normalcy and
Hmm.
that routine feels safe for them. And then the things that they would be open to accepting help for, they can star, or they can circle. Then I encourage them to put it up on the fridge. And when somebody reaches out to say, what can I do? They can
Hmm.
say, actually, I have a list. Give me a second. I'm going to go check the list and I'll give you a couple of ideas. And that way they
Hmm.
can sort of match up the need with the person who's offering. If it fits, if it works, beautiful. And then
Yeah.
everybody feels like they're not as overwhelmed trying to brainstorm something and it's going to land well. They know it's
Yeah.
actually something that's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, that is really, really great advice because it's so practical. Because as you said, mourning can be messy and the thoughts are just swirling. And it is so hard to organize your thoughts when you're experiencing deep pain or just confusion or not sure how to even take a step forward, how to even take your next breath. Sometimes can it can feel that way. And so that list I think is very good practical advice. It can help somebody, they can fill it out at their own pace even, and then when they're ready to interact with people. Do you have other advice for supportive others? That's good advice for the person who has lost somebody. I noted in your book you did have a couple of please don'ts. You mentioned one of them. Do you have a couple of others that you can share?
Yeah, really avoiding a couple of things. Avoiding trying to make sense of somebody else's loss for them.
Yeah.
That's their work. And whether or not they come to clarity is their own process. They might continue to live alongside big, heavy questions that never are answered. And that could be their grief journey. And that's really common. Or they might be able to find some sense of meaning and maybe purpose and something that they learned, some bit of growth, something that comes out of their grief that they can kind of hang on to and honor as part of it. That can happen, it might not, but it should never come from an external source. Or deciding how someone should grieve, telling
Yeah.
them, prescribing them, what is that next step? Here's what
Hmm.
you should do, or here's
Hmm.
what I did and it worked well
Hmm.
for me.
Hmm.
You might be able to say, I found this useful, but I have a very particular way of offering up ideas as options versus a prescription or versus anything that sounds like it's a demand on the person or that they should be doing it. We really don't get to decide that, and instead, I think it's really useful to become a bridge to options for people. So you might say, there's this that's available. You might not be aware of it, or I'm not sure if that is an option in our community, but I'm happy to look into it for you to do a little research on your behalf. And then really empowering the person to choose for themselves because
Mhm.
they have limited energy available. Grieving is exhausting for
Mhm.
most people, most of the
Mhm.
time when it's deep grief. So they need to be reserving their energy for that, for leaning into the loss, for leaning back into life and resting as much as they can. So, yeah, not determining what it means, how somebody should feel, what they should be doing. Those are no-nos.
Uh, that's very good advice. And I heard something I want to just emphasize. Um, I notice when people I know, and myself included, when we have a cold, we're
Mm.
exhausted. A cold. Now you hear about
Exactly.
people having a cold and you just think they have a cold. It's no big deal. I have a cold. It's no big deal. Colds are exhausting. You don't appreciate how exhausted you are until you have the cold yourself. And then you're still surprised because you're so tired. Grief is exhausting. And I think people also have the idea that they'll get through it without that. Um, and you're an expert on that, and you can probably say it's exhausting. And so one of the things you say in terms of healing, you offer three things. Lean into that loss. Go ahead and talk about it at their own pace and readiness in their own way, but lean into the loss. There's a loss. Acknowledge it. Lean into life. Life is still there. And so both are true at the same time. And then your third was rest because it's exhausting. Yeah, that's really good advice. And I don't think it's talked about very much, just how exhausting grief is.
And how people sort of cycle between the three.
Uh-huh.
And at different moments, they have a different focus, and that is completely natural and healthy. So it's not like sometimes you're sort of feeling like you're holding all of it. You're trying to keep everything up in the air and you're juggling so much. And then sometimes for a grieving person, they really are able to, and they would like to set something aside to focus in. So maybe I've worked with some people who have created a mourning corner or a grief altar as a place where they could go visit. And they set aside time for that in their daily or weekly schedule. And they're setting aside everything else at that time. The rest of life is on pause, and they're purely focusing on their grief and whatever needs to come up in that process during that day is what happens. And they're just allowing it and inviting it and giving it some air, giving it some space. And then at other times, people, especially people who utilize something like that, they might have other moments that they really want to not focus on their grief and focus
Mhm.
on something in life. Focus on a big moment that's happening that's maybe more of a celebration or something that's challenging, something that's requiring their mental energy. It could even be finishing their taxes. And they want to set aside the loss and set aside the grief to make space for that and to focus in. That's
Mhm.
not avoidance. That's not unhealthy. That's balancing
Mhm.
because we continue to be living life and life continues to be pretty demanding and
Mhm.
asks a lot of us. We're generally not able to grieve and only grieve for a full year. Also, as you know, psychologically, we can't force ourselves to just purely grieve nonstop 24/7, thinking that if we're able to do that, we can get to the other side of it faster.
Right.
That's not healthy either. We need to
Right.
like really cycle between those three.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And the rest component is very important.
Hmm.
Yeah. Even just acknowledging the need for it. Um, I work with individuals who are suicidal, and I have had the experience of working with family members who have lost somebody to suicide. I was wondering if there was any advice you would give to loved ones who have lost somebody to suicide.
I think knowing that going in, it's going to have it's a different type of grief generally. And for people who perhaps didn't have the opportunity for that longer last chapter, those goodbyes, those conversations where that didn't happen, that adds to the weight of grief for a lot of people, and also questions around whether that person was known to be suicidal or not leading up, how shocking it maybe was. It always ends up being shocking on some level when it does happen, even if the person has been suicidal leading
Mhm.
up and has been vocal about that. Recognizing that there are swirling questions generally in every survivor's mind about what was my role, what was my part, what could I have done, what is my responsibility. There's a lot of wrestling with those questions. I worked with a younger person after the suicide death of their sister, and it was incredibly challenging to think about the person's life and the love that was there and how to continue carrying that and the what can really feel like conflicting emotions that can lead to guilt like anger
Mhm.
and allowing for anger, allowing for frustration, allowing for that regret. I mean, those more complex emotions, which are naturally more prevalent after a suicide death,
Mhm.
making space for that and normalizing that and saying you can actually hold both. If it happened to be a healthy, positive, loving relationship, there can still be all this mess of emotion that's now intertwined as part of the grief, and they don't cancel each other out. They
Yeah.
can all be there simultaneously. But I think when it comes to death by suicide, what I noticed on a community level is people are much more hesitant to reach out and step in because it feels so intense and
Mhm.
it's really intimidating. And
Mhm.
so I'm hoping with offering up some language and some compassionate support techniques, people will feel like they can show up, even if they're showing up to say, I am at a loss about your loss. I don't
Mhm.
have the words. I wanted to still show up. I'm here.
Yeah. It just brings me right back to how I started this podcast with your words. Significant loss like that is meant to be felt, expressed, held, and digested. That grief, same grief, it's boundless and wild, and mourning can be messy. It holds true whether it was somebody who was 104 years old and everybody was ready and everybody was prepared versus somebody much younger and maybe in a sudden death, a sudden tragic death, whether it was suicide or some sort of accident or illness or something. Um, that loss is meant to be felt, expressed, held, and digested. I just thought that was so beautiful and a good way to understand how grief is universal. Whether it's our own or somebody else's, we can definitely experience it with them. There is some discomfort sometimes in how to have the conversation, how to be supportive. But your book, Kindred Grief Care, is a good place to start. I recommend folks buy it and read it for sure. And like you said, there are some resources in there for both loved ones and somebody experiencing grief themselves that could be helpful through the process.
Thank you. I mean, I hope I've learned so much from the people that I've supported and through my own losses that I really wanted to offer that up to other people because I have fumbled through it and found ways to find my way in and then learned directly from people grieving what has landed well, what hasn't, how to personalize these approaches, how to try to come from a place of compassion and sensitivity in these moments that are really profound.
Yeah, that compassion comes up a lot in your book. having compassion, which I think is important. And also, you talk a lot about s- uh, you call it shifting in and shifting out, but taking that moment even when you're supporting somebody to center yourself. But you talked about it earlier, in fact. What can I offer? Where am I at? What am I experiencing right now? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Go ahead and have that whole understanding with yourself before you say anything, and then offer what you can.
Absolutely. And trying to continue to build that level of self-awareness and
Hmm.
recognizing, what is mine. And because things are going to come up when you're in an emotional space with someone, it's going to activate things within you that will happen. And
Hmm.
so knowing that in advance it will happen, and then what do we do with that when it does? And then how do we address it and tend to it after as well?
Yeah, yeah. Such a beautiful book. And your work is really, really important. Thank you for being here today. For those listening, if you want more information, her website is
FrancescaLynnArnoldy.com or contemplativedoula.com takes you to the same
excellent.
place.
And you can come to choosinghelp.com as well for additional resources or for contact information for Francesca. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Tracy.